are listening to Al Mubarak Radio and watching Al Mubarak TV via YouTube with our official partners, Interpal. Tonight's show, which is Real Talk, presented by myself, Dr. Abdul Basit Sheikh, will actually be looking at the crisis in Peshawar. So before we actually deal with the shocking events of this week in Pakistan. Just a reminder for our listeners and viewers that if you actually wish to take part in this debate and discussion regarding the crisis in Pakistan, you can ring us in on 01924 472 776 or text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. I'll just repeat the numbers again for our listeners and our viewers via the internet. You can ring us in on 01924 472 776 or text us or WhatsApp us on 07868 476 577. So it's Friday night and we are live on Al Mubarak Radio and Al Mubarak TV with Real Talk. And Real Talk is a program that actually looks at the real issues affecting people right around the world. So to begin tonight's show, we need to basically look at the situation in Pakistan. I'm sure most of our listeners and our viewers will be aware of the shocking and tragic events that have affected Pakistan this week, with the killing of nearly 134 school children and 9 teachers in a army school in Peshawar. So the events, as I was saying earlier, have been truly horrific, savage, barbaric. Many people are now thinking in terms of the fact that why was this such a situation allowed to materialize? Why are people actually indiscriminately killing one another? And what purpose does killing actually serve? So these are the topics we're actually going to explore. So I mean, if you look at the Pakistani nation, a nation that's been in existence since 1947, ultimately Pakistan stands at the crossroads now in terms of the regional influence and the power it actually has in Southeast Asia. Pakistan ultimately is in a deep sense of shock, in a deep sense of grief in relation to the loss of its children. I mean, many Muslims have around the world have started questioning the fact that, why are innocent children actually being killed? What purpose does it serve? It's, basically people are now questioning in terms of the fact that why on earth have children actually been targeted who are innocent, who've actually gone to school. So ultimately, this show tonight is actually going to now look at the issues in terms of why this situation actually has occurred. I mean, if we actually look at the statement released by the Afghan Taliban, they've basically condemned the actual atrocities and the actions of the perpetrators, or those who were actually behind the the barbaric and savage attack in Peshawar earlier this week. But now, we need to basically understand why this situation actually occurred, why these tragic events unfolded the actual way it did. And it all basically, coincides with the events after 9/11, in the sense that, Pakistan and Afghanistan were actually plunged in a battle between, called the war on terror. So ultimately, after the events of 9/11, where the situation actually centered quite quickly upon Afghanistan, after the American government actually believed that Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden, were actually behind the attacks on the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center in New York. So ultimately, we find, if we actually fast forward nearly 13 years, we actually find that Pakistan is basically in a state of civil war, where there are elements within the actual country that are fighting for the soul and the heart of Pakistan. So basically, this is, many commentators are basically stating that this is a battle between the extremists, the ones that actually, hate the fact that Pakistan is actually going, embracing modernity, and those forces that actually want to maintain, the traditional power that's actually been there for centuries within the Pakistani state. But ultimately, we have to go behind the situation in terms of what the events that actually led to this particular situation this week. And ultimately, what we've actually got to look at is the fact that why certain individuals took it upon themselves in order to basically attack a school that housed a number of children. And some commentators and even elements within the Taliban have stated that this particular act that actually took place in Peshawar was as a result of the fact that innocent people and children have actually been targeted on the Afghan-Pakistan border, the northwest frontier, Waziristan, autonomous areas that have where the people actually have been given a large degree of autonomy in order to basically conduct their own affairs on the Afghan-Pakistan tribal belt. So some elements of the Taliban basically have argued that this was basically retaliation or qisas in order for the acts carried out by the Pakistan army. But ultimately, what we are interested in tonight is the fact that in Islam, the killing of innocents, killing of women, the uprooting of trees, or the desecration of places of worship is completely forbidden in Islam. And this is the actual crux of the matter in terms of the fact that is an eye for an eye actually justified within Islam, because you have certain elements within the Muslim faith who have argued that qisas or retaliation is justified, especially where one's loved ones, where one's husband or wife or children have actually been killed. That some elements within the Muslim community in Pakistan have basically took it upon themselves in order to basically conduct a revenge mission. But ultimately, what we have to actually look at is the fact that what benefit has it brought to anybody, any community in Pakistan, as a result of a Muslim killing a Muslim, and this particular cycle of violence actually just continuing, where in fact Muslims are killing Muslims in Pakistan. And what is the end game, or what's the end result? I mean, the end result seems to be more carnage after carnage, more bloodshed, and then you have bloodshed in return for that matter. And this basically raises very serious questions in terms of the fact that what lies in wait for Pakistan in the future. That as far as I'm concerned, the Pakistan is very much at the center of this battle between fundamentalism and extremism. And indeed, it can be said that Pakistan is actually at the crossroads in terms of the fact that now he actually faces a dilemma in terms of whether to actually maintain the status quo or actually take on this battle against those who are seeking to undermine the Pakistani nation and Pakistani sovereignty for that particular matter. I mean, as far as Islam is actually concerned, the killing of innocent children is basically completely unlawful, and it has to be condemned, because we've got to look at these poor innocent children. Their parents will probably grieve, will be grieving, and will be in a state of shock. And ultimately, many of these parents will actually never ever get over the fact that they've actually lost their loved ones in this particular tragic, and unfortunate. It just goes to show the actual seriousness of the situation in Pakistan at this moment in time. And it's this battle between extremism and these issues against the forces that actually support extremism. And extremism ultimately comes about as a result of the fact that people actually feel threatened. So I mean, there are elements within Pakistan and other Muslim countries who ultimately feel threatened by Western values or Western traditions or even Western systems for that particular matter. It's always this fear of the unknown, or fear of the fact that the other alien or other foreign systems ultimately will have an impact on the culture and the faith and the religion or in any particular society, especially when we're actually looking at the dynamics of the Muslim world. So ultimately, Pakistan now, faces a very uncertain future in terms of how to actually put a lid on this, on this, type of madness that ultimately has involved many people actually being killed, where killing is actually being met by killing, where violence is actually leading to more violence, and I'm sure that most of our listeners and our viewers will actually agree that the only way that conflicts can actually be solved is by groups actually sitting down at the table and actually talking and thrashing out a future that is positive for for the citizens of Pakistan. I'm just going to take a break just to mention that if any of our listeners or any of our viewers on the internet actually want to get involved in this program, we welcome comments, suggestions, and even people phoning in to give their view. I'm sure there will be many of our listeners who actually have an attachment on affinity to Pakistan. So if you wish to actually ring in and give your views, then feel free to ring us in on 01924 472 776. I'll just repeat the number again: 01924 472 776. Or if you don't want to ring us in, you can always text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. I'll just repeat the number again: 07868 476 577. So any of our viewers or listeners are actually joining us now. We're actually talking about the events, the tragic events this week in Peshawar, that these, this particular tragic event actually led to the deaths of 134 children and at least 9 teachers in an army school in Peshawar. These acts have completely shocked the world, and the actual Pakistani state is actually in a state of mourning. I believe the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, actually declared 3 days of national mourning, and I'm sure most of the the Pakistani diaspora in the UK and Europe have been holding a 1-minute silence and a vigil in remembrance of those who actually lost their lives in the brutal and savage attack on the army school in Peshawar. So ultimately, the events in Peshawar are part of an underlying issue that is actually affecting Muslim countries in terms of the fact that whether why are certain Muslim groups involved in violence, why are they actually using violence to actually to propagate their aims, and why they're actually using violence as a tool in order to basically ram home their advantage, as to speak, within the countries themselves. I mean, for example, if you go to Nigeria, for example, we have a group called Boko Haram who basically are against everything that is Western and that is secular. I mean, the actual term Boko Haram refers to Western education is forbidden. So we need to ask ourselves the question that why do Muslims actually feel so threatened about Western values and Western societies? I'm sure most of us actually are, who live in the UK have actually been, maybe third or fourth generation who've actually been brought up in the United Kingdom. I mean, many Muslims can identify the fact that they are at peace with the wider society in the United Kingdom. They're comfortable with the culture they have, with the language they actually speak, and they're comfortable about living in Western countries. So why is it that in Muslim countries, for example, why do Muslims actually feel uncomfortable in terms of dealing with modernity and Western values, for that matter? Are Western values threatening the very fabric of Muslim way of life, or even the culture and the fabric of a particular society? So ultimately, the events of Peshawar ultimately do show that the actual nation Pakistan itself is very much in a crisis, where ultimately people are actually struggling to actually come up with a solution in order to basically stop this, what we could describe as a civil war that's been raging in Pakistan for at least 10 years for that particular matter. That ultimately the people, ultimately the Pakistani people want to live in peace, want stability, want a huge reduction in in violence, and ultimately, to have a nation that's at war, with itself, ultimately does not bode for the country's prosperity and the economy for that particular matter. So ultimately, there's many issues that we can actually explore tonight in terms of the fact that why are certain people, are they actually engaging in this particular type of action, or engaging in violence for that particular matter. I mean, if elements of the Pakistan Taliban, have argued in recent days, months, and years that the Pakistani army ultimately has a agenda in terms of basically undermining the religious fabric of the actual country, or the way of life for many Pakistanis, or even those Pakistanis who have an affinity to Afghanistan, those who live on the Afghan-Pakistan border, the northwest frontier, and Waziristan for that particular matter. So ultimately, what is the situation, and how should we actually address the situation in this particular matter? I think this issue of identity, especially Muslim identity, is something that Muslims are having to grapple with and having to actually deal with in many parts of the world. Because if you look at the fact that we're in the 21st century now, look at how society is actually evolving, and how technology is actually, there's rapid advances in technology, how society is actually being, is changing or evolving for that particular matter. And this in itself actually brings challenges to Muslim communities right around the world, in terms of how far to actually embrace with Western values, Western systems, and to what extent should they be embraced, to what extent should they actually be put on the shelf, as to speak. And these are issues that ultimately are having to be dealt with by Muslim communities and Muslims right around the world. And ultimately, Pakistan ultimately faces a lot of questions that it's not going to be easy for any government, or even the army for that matter, ultimately to restore restore stability, and basically reduce the violence. Because ultimately, where you have two actors at odds with one another in a particular nation, ultimately the only way you can actually bring a halt to the bloodshed is ultimately through dialogue and discussion. That even if you look at, for example, Northern Ireland, for that particular matter, for many years historically, there were many conflicts between certain individuals for that particular matter, between the Protestants and the Catholics. Ultimately, for many years, many people got killed and many people got injured. But ultimately, history teaches us that when the two opposing forces actually sat down, and that I'm referring to the Protestants and the Catholics, ultimately, through the Good Friday Agreement nearly 20 years ago, it brought peace and stability to an area of the world not far from here in Northern Ireland. That actually, has meant that for 20 years, I mean, even though there's been at times there's been tensions between Protestants and Catholics, ultimately Northern Ireland has enjoyed a period of stability that, if you said 40 years ago, it would have been Northern Ireland would be living in peace and stability, people would have laughed at you. So ultimately, through negotiation and peace, ultimately you find that conflicts can actually be ended. So being the ever optimist, ultimately we can see a bright future for Pakistan. But the only way the bright future is actually going to come about is through negotiation, and not necessarily compromise, but ultimately negotiation between the various groups, the army, the government, and elements of the Pakistani Taliban, ultimately coming together, talking, having dialogue, having discussion, in order to basically stop this bloodshed. Because, I mean, if you look over the border in India, for example, India is probably one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing economy in the world, with a growth rate of 9%. But, the only way India is actually thriving is as a result of the fact that there's peace and stability. I mean, there are areas within India that ultimately there is conflict, and there are battles between the government and the separatists. But largely, India, to all intents and purposes, is very much a stable and a peaceful country. But in direct contrast, if you actually look at Pakistan, ultimately you find that peace and stability is coming at a premium, and this week's events ultimately underline the fact that this particular type of madness or bloodshed that's actually being perpetuated on a daily basis ultimately does not serve anyone well, especially going forward. I mean, ultimately for children to actually be killed, just goes to show to what depths people are prepared to actually sink to in order to actually further their aims. I mean, whether a child is actually killed in Waziristan or whether a child is actually killed in Peshawar, ultimately they are our part of our community. They are part of humanity, and for any child to actually be killed in that particular manner is completely and utterly unacceptable, and has to be condemned. That whether it's a child in Nigeria, whether it's a child in Syria, ultimately a child does not deserve to basically die in a brutal manner in the way those children actually died in Peshawar. So before I continue with this particular program in terms of the aftermath of the Peshawar attacks, I'm sure there's many of our viewers and listeners that are actually tuned in to this particular program. So we would actually welcome your comments and your suggestions, or even if you wish to call us in on 01924 472 776. I'll just repeat the number again for our viewers and listeners: 01924 472 776. Or if you want to text us or WhatsApp us, do so on 07868 476 577, or text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. So those of you who are actually just tuning in now or actually watching this particular live transmission on Mubarak Radio Real Talk, we're actually talking about the aftermath of the attack in Peshawar earlier this week. I mean, ultimately, we are at the crossroads in terms of the fact that ultimately which direction is Pakistan actually heading in now. That ultimately, is it going to be the status quo that people are going to be killed and this cycle of violence is going to continue, or are groups actually going to think that now ultimately enough is enough, that enough blood has actually been shed, we need to actually get around the table and we need to actually discuss this particular matter and ultimately find a solution in order to basically stop the bloodshed that's actually continuing in Pakistan at this moment in time. I mean, ultimately, I am of the opinion that wherever you actually live, ultimately people have a right to live in peace, have a right to have a respectable amount of security, and people have a right to actually get on with their lives. And I'm sure every single human in the free world ultimately shares this particular desire or passion to actually live in peace, have stability, in order to basically improve their own condition and improve their own lot and make a contribution to society. And I'm sure if you talk to many Pakistanis around the world, and even if you talk to Pakistanis in Pakistan itself, ultimately nobody who will say that they don't actually want to live in peace and stability. Ultimately, everybody has grievances, but ultimately those grievances, as far as I'm concerned, have to be channeled in a positive and in a professional manner without resorting to violence and bloodshed, and ultimately to bring children into the equation, whether it be in Waziristan or whether it be in Peshawar. Ultimately, children should not actually be brought in to a battle where adults are actually fighting one another. I mean, some of the scenes that we witnessed this week in relation to the aftermath after the killing of these children, beggars belief that people, children in a school in Peshawar, ultimately were going about getting an education so that they could actually grow up and become citizens that actually provide to the provide something towards the prosperity of the Pakistani nation in the long term. Their lives were actually cruelly cut short due to the actions of particular individuals that were actually have been who have been accused of actually belonging to the Taliban group in Pakistan for that particular matter. So ultimately, what we've actually got to understand is the fact that what actually possesses certain individuals to actually arm themselves and actually go into a school and actually kill innocent children in an indiscriminate manner. Ultimately, there has to be there has to be a reason why such actions are actually have been carried out in the name of Islam. And ultimately, many Muslims and even the Islamic tradition will say that it's completely unlawful for innocent children to actually be killed. That ultimately children have protected status in Islam, especially where there is war or where there is particular conflict, and in order to target children in this particular manner is completely unacceptable. And I think the certain key actors in Pakistan actually have to come together in order to basically sit around the table and have discussions and discuss issues that are affecting the people of Pakistan, because ultimately Pakistan is actually not going to go forward. It's going to be stuck in a rut if this particular cycle of violence actually continues for any longer. I mean, if you look at the fact that how many hundreds of thousands of people have actually died in Pakistan, whether it be in shootings, whether it be in conflicts within tribal areas, whether it be bombings, ultimately it's having an effect on every single Pakistani citizen in the actual country, and also amongst the Pakistani diaspora who live actually right around the world. I mean, Pakistan is a great nation, has a proud history. Ultimately, has one of the most powerful armies in the world, not just the Muslim world, but right around the world. That Pakistani soldiers ultimately have a fearsome reputation for the fact that they have valor and bravery on the battlefield. And ultimately, our appeal is to the various elements in Pakistan that they must actually come and sit down around the table and negotiate and discuss the issues that are causing this particular conflict, and bring this conflict to a head for that particular matter. I mean, ultimately everybody has their own views. Everybody ultimately has baggage and has a different take on the way for example, a particular country, what direction is actually should be going in, what strategies should it actually implement in order to create progression, in order to actually ensure that the country becomes prosperous in the long term for that particular matter. And ultimately, what kind of advert does it basically show to the wider world, that you have people actually going into a school or going into a village in on the Afghan-Pakistan border, and where innocent people are actually being killed? Because you'll find that most of these conflicts that occur around the world, vast majority of the casualties are actually amongst the civilians. That there are more civilians than army personnel that actually get killed or injured in conflicts, whether they be in Pakistan, whether it be Nigeria, whether it's Syria, Yemen, wherever you look in the world, it's always innocent people that actually get displaced, who lose their livelihoods, who lose their homes, who get killed, injured, maimed. Is vast majority of the time is more innocent civilians actually get killed, injured, and maimed than army personnel. And I would actually challenge anybody to basically say anything on the contrary for that particular matter. So I'm just going to do another reminder again. If anybody actually wants to ring us in, or actually wants to text us or WhatsApp us any suggestions, any comments, anything they agree or disagree with what I am saying, we welcome constructive dialogue or constructive criticisms or even positive suggestions. So please ring us in on 01924 472 776. And I'll just repeat the number again: 01924 472 4776. Or if you don't want to ring in, please feel free to actually text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. And I'll just repeat that number again: 07868 476 577. So those of you actually just joining us now on Friday evening, you're actually now tuned into Real Talk. We're actually talking about the aftermath of the crisis in Peshawar based on the events this week that led to the deaths of 134 children and 9 teachers in a army school in Peshawar. So ultimately, violence. Some actors, right around the world, whether it be Islamic groups or non-Islamic groups, for example, ultimately many groups throughout history have actually justified violence in order to actually further their aims. But if you actually generally look at the history of these particular groups, very few of these groups have actually ultimately fulfilled their aims through violence. And if you actually look at Northern Ireland, for example, Sinn Féin and the various unionist organizations ultimately in the end had to basically abandon the bullets, the bombs and the guns for talking around a table. And ultimately the Good Friday Agreement in the early 90s ultimately brought about peace and stability to Northern Ireland. So I think for the people of Pakistan, they need to look at the example of Northern Ireland, where an area that had been gripped by violence and conflict for nearly 60 to 70 years, ultimately peace actually came, even despite the of many people in Northern Ireland and on the UK mainland, that ultimately Northern Ireland basically acts as a symbol of hope to people right around the world involved in conflict zones, that no matter how brutal the conflict, ultimately a solution can be found. But ultimately that solution can only be found if people are actually willing to come around the table, sit down and basically talk and try to thrash out and iron out their differences over the issues that they actually have. And ultimately, Pakistan ultimately is a great nation. It's basically sad to see that people are actually tearing each other apart in order to actually further their aims. And ultimately, it's been a very sad week for the Pakistani community, right around the world, and many people cannot basically understand that why this event actually took place, and people just cannot understand the fact that why children were actually targeted. I mean, in order to basically, it's completely, unjustified to find, children anywhere in the world in any conflict zone actually being targeted or being groomed to become soldiers, because children, are innocent individuals. And I'm sure most of us have actually been in the company of children or have children, that they're very innocent, precious precious individuals. They're special, especially to parents and the mothers and the fathers. They bring a sense of joy, excitement and happiness. I mean, many parents love it, the fact that ultimately the children are actually growing up, and all of us want our children to actually grow up in a stable and prosperous environment, that our children go on to become great citizens. I mean, this week 134 children have been robbed of their lives, as to speak. And over what? I mean, ultimately, we have to also condemn the actions of the Pakistani army in the tribal areas, who have actually, because the Pakistani army has been involved in the killing of in civilians and children in the tribal areas bordering Afghanistan. So ultimately that has to be condemned as well. And that's something that's not been picked up by the media this week, of the ongoing campaign in the tribal areas, where many innocent men and women and children have actually been targeted through the Pakistani army's campaign against elements of the Taliban on the Pakistan side of the Afghan border. And ultimately, we have to equally condemn the actual actions of those perpetrators or those individuals who were involved in the shooting of 134 children in the army school in Peshawar. Because ultimately in this situation, what we have is violence is begetting violence, that where certain groups are actually engaging in violence, then the other group is actually then retaliated in the same manner. Some people have argued that ultimately, if you retaliate against somebody, then you're just as bad as them. So we have a situation where where both groups, whether the Pakistani army or those who have been accused of being part of the Pakistani Taliban, ultimately, we have a situation where both groups are equally culpable in terms of the murder and the savage killing of these innocent children for that particular matter. So I think we as Muslims right around the world owe it to the children right around the world that they actually grow up in in an environment that is basically peaceful, that is stable, because our children actually deserve a future where they can actually prosper, they can actually go on to do greater things. I mean, the last thing that we want is our children's lives actually being cut short, and the lives of those 134 children were actually tragically cut short this week, that their parents will never know what their children would have actually become, what they would have done in their future life. They'll always be left thinking, I wish I could have spent an extra day, with my child, and enjoyed them actually growing up. Most of those, the parents, will now even be in a sense of shock, sense of grief, and our condolences actually go out to the parents of those 134 children, and also to the parents of those who have actually been killed within Pakistan itself for the last 13 years. That there are many unknown cases of families where they have lost children as a result of the conflict within Pakistan that's been raging since 2001. There are hundreds and thousands of people have actually been killed as a result of the conflict within Pakistan itself. I mean, how many governments have actually come and gone in Pakistan? We probably couldn't even count them on our hands. But ultimately, the situation has not got better, even when the military has actually been ruling Pakistan, when there's been a civilian government ruling Pakistan. Ultimately, the situation is actually getting worse day by day. And why, we have to ask ourselves the question: why is it that Muslim countries are always in conflict, and why there is internal conflict within Muslim countries, especially in comparison to non-Muslim countries who are enjoying peace and stability, even though the economy may be struggling in many Western countries or many non-Muslim countries. But ultimately, to a large extent, they are ultimately enjoying peace and stability compared to Muslim countries. So we have to ask ourselves the questions. I mean, many Muslims probably don't even think about the fact that why Muslim countries are perpetually in strife at this moment in time. Why is there so much conflict and bloodshed only in Muslim countries? Is something that we need to actually look at as Muslims, in terms of the fact that why our countries, where there are predominantly Muslim populations, why are they beset with so many problems, whether it be social, whether it be economic, whether why do we have various groups actually resorting to violence in order to actually further their aims? I mean, ultimately, I lived in Yemen many years ago, and the last 2 years Yemen has had, since the Arab Spring in 2011, Yemen has been in perpetual turmoil, where armed groups from the countryside have actually even taken over the capital city in order to actually further their aims, namely the Houthis, for example. So if you look at many of the Muslim countries since the Arab Spring, and in Pakistan's case since 9/11, that they've been plunged in turmoil. And I mean, the only way that you can actually reduce the turmoil is to basically sit down and talk, because without talking, without dialogue, without conversation, ultimately, people who are actually perpetuating violence will never ever succeed in their aims. And history has actually shown us that violence very rarely or seldom basically settles issues or brings peace and stability for that particular matter. And in recent times, we find that mostly through negotiation and through talking and dialogue, ultimately that is the only way the conflicts that actually have been solved for that matter. So I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there is hope for Pakistan, and Pakistan can basically put itself on the road to stability and peace. But ultimately, we need reconciliation is actually needed amongst the various stakeholders in Pakistani society, and they have to come together and basically discuss the issues that are affecting the nation. And I'm sure through negotiations, through talks, ultimately people sitting around the table, they can actually create a better future for for Pakistan going long term. You only have to look at the example of other countries such as India, for example, to see how how they are thriving, how they've become prosperous. And it's no secret that because the countries are peace, are at peace, and to a large extent enjoying stability, that stability brings with it investment and economic prosperity for that matter. I mean, Pakistan will never have a strong economy unless it basically deals with the issue of violence within the countries, and in order to and it must make strenuous efforts in order to basically bring about peace. I mean, just if the government decides to basically go after elements that are involved in extremism or fundamentalism, or even what could be described as terrorism in Pakistan, ultimately that's only going to get the backs up of the groups that are actually being attacked by the state institutions, whether it be the government or the army. And ultimately, violence is only going to perpetuate violence, and this cycle of violence is just going to continue without any resolution to this particular matter. I mean, if you look at Afghanistan, for example, since 9/11, billions of pounds have actually been spent in Afghanistan, and even in Iraq for that matter. And these countries are actually failed states. Whether we look at Iraq or Afghanistan, is completely and utterly they're failed states as a result of the fact that money has been pumped into the countries in order to basically fight fringe elements and fight various groups. And ultimately, all it's done is perpetuate more violence and created instability to such an extent that non-state actors have actually taken the reins of power, as to speak. For example, if we look at Iraq, for example, since 2003, that ultimately, Iraqis, whether it be Shia, Sunni, or even Kurd, for that particular matter, have not enjoyed stability for the last 11 years, because constantly the country's factions have actually been at war with one another. So ultimately, sectarianism is another big issue that's affecting the Muslim countries, that ultimately, whether it be Iraq, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, even Pakistan, Sunnis fighting Shias does not basically bode well for the stability and the actual fabric of the Muslim countries. And Muslims must recognize that even though there may be differences between the Shia and the Sunnis, ultimately by killing one another in the name of sectarianism, ultimately, doesn't actually bring any benefits to any of those groups whatsoever. Even where there are disagreements and differences, ultimately is good to agree to disagree without resorting to bloodshed. And another issue that Muslim nations and Muslim societies need to be aware of, that they must deal with their citizens in a fair and impartial manner, that they must provide economic freedoms, social freedoms, educational freedoms to their citizens in order to allow societies to flourish. I mean, ultimately, to have autocracies or dictatorships or even monarchies basically ruling in an absolute manner does not bode well for the fabric and the cohesion of societies right across the Muslim world. I mean, the Muslim world, would do well to actually take out a leaf of of many Western countries, in terms of the fact that many Western countries today are very stable, very prosperous from an economic perspective, where they give freedoms to individuals and to various stakeholders in society in order to actually allow them to prosper in the various countries in the West. So the Muslim countries, even though nearly 1200 years ago, Muslim countries were far more advanced than Western countries, but what we have had in the last 500 years has been a complete role reversal, in terms of the fact that the Muslim societies and countries have actually declined, where the West has actually maintained its hegemony and its strength over the last 500 years. So ultimately, at this point, I'm just going to put a reminder out that if any of our listeners and viewers via the internet want to actually contribute towards this program, feel free to do so. Ring us in on 01924 472 776. I'll just repeat the number again: 01924 472 776, or text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. And I'll just repeat the number again for our viewers and listeners: 07868 476 577. So anybody who's actually just tuning in now or watching this particular live broadcast, Real Talk, we're actually looking at the aftermath of the actual attack on the army school in Peshawar, and in terms of the fact that where does this leave Pakistan? Is Pakistan at the crossroads? Is it too late for Pakistan to basically rescue itself, or is there hope, or is there a glimmer of hope that Pakistan can actually be put back on the road to peace and stability? And ultimately, I'm forever an optimist, but I always believe that where there are two factions at loggerheads or disagree with one another, ultimately groups have to come together, have to sit down and actually talk in order to actually bring about stability and order. And I'm sure the Pakistani Taliban, I'm sure the Pakistani army, I'm sure the Pakistani government has its has its people has its interests of its people is of paramount importance. I don't think you'll find any Pakistani who doesn't want good for their country or for their people, for that particular matter. But ultimately, violence is not something that one actually achieves their aims through. It's very easy to say by basically using a gun or by using a bomb or engaging in violence that one's aims can actually be furthered. Ultimately, on the contrary, ultimately you'll find that by talking and by being engaged in discussion and dialogue, ultimately it can resolve issues in an amicable and in a professional manner. Because none of us actually want to see another event or another situation that involves the murder of children ever again. I sincerely hope that we don't actually see another event like this, because ultimately that's really going to take Pakistan back into the abyss, as to speak, if another situation like this materializes. Ultimately, those people who actually are involved in the killing of children, innocent children or innocent civilians for that matter, one has to question whether they actually have a conscience in the first place, that it must take a particular type of individual or person to be so angry that they can actually take a gun into a school and ultimately shoot innocent children who have actually had no part in the conflict whatsoever, just because a child in an army school whose parents may be involved in a campaign in Waziristan does not mean that the child of the army colonel or army sergeant or corporal, for example, does it mean that their children deserve to die in such a brutal manner? The answer is no. Ultimately, it's completely unacceptable. The actual killing of children anywhere in the world should be and utterly be condemned, because ultimately children are innocent, and they are not responsible for their actions until they go beyond a particular age, and to cut the lives of these children short in such a tragic manner, just shows that where are humans really humans, or have humans actually become animals, in the sense that they can actually behave in this matter. And even it's probably an insult to call an individual an animal, because even animals would not actually behave in this particular manner. And it's all about containing anger, and it's all about basically containing frustration and dealing with frustration and stress. And as individuals, ultimately we owe it to ourselves, we have a responsibility to others as well, that we control our anger, and we actually channel our anger through the correct mediums rather than actually resort to violence, for that matter. Because as I was saying earlier in the actual program, violence doesn't, one may think that violence actually can achieve one's aims, but in generally, if you actually look at history, we will find that very rarely does violence actually result in a victory for a particular group, for that matter, if you even actually look at the events after the Second World War, if you look at Vietnam, for example, it's only through negotiation that the conflict in Vietnam was actually resolved. If you look at Cambodia, for example, you needed peace talks in order to basically bring a solution to the Cambodian problem between the Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian government for that particular matter. So ultimately, many conflicts have been resolved ultimately through negotiations and putting away the gun and the bullet, and basically encouraging dialogue and discussion for that particular matter. And it's very, very important that wherever we have disagreements, issues, problems, we should basically be man enough, no pun intended. We should be man enough in order to basically come round the table and talk to people who we don't necessarily see eye to eye with, and in order to basically thrash out issues, resolve issues, and bring about solutions that will actually benefit the wider society for that particular manner. So ultimately, there are many lessons to be learned from the events of this particular week. That ultimately it's been a very difficult week for many people around the world after hearing about the actual attacks in Peshawar. And for our local listeners who are tuned in, there is going to be a vigil tomorrow outside Dewsbury Town Hall. I believe it's at 1:30, I may be wrong, where people are actually going to gather together in order to basically say no to terrorism and ultimately, pay their respects to those people who actually died in Peshawar. I mean, if you actually look at the, many historians, many scholars have basically said that the 20th century was the bloodiest in history, but I think the 21st century probably will be more bloodier than the 20th century as a result of the amount of people actually engaged in violence and the amount of people that have been killed and injured in the name of religion. I mean, ultimately, many people are against religion in the sense that they believe that religion is the root of all these problems, and religion basically leads to violence. I mean, I wouldn't say that religion leads to violence. I mean, many cases people do use the name of Allah or the name of Christ or the name of other faiths in order to basically justify violence. But ultimately, no religion basically preaches violence or preaches terrorism for that particular matter. But ultimately, it all comes down to interpretation, that some people actually interpret scripture or interpret the religious text in order to basically justify their actions. But ultimately, as individuals and as human beings, we owe it to the wider community, wider society, that where there is an issue, that rather than resort to arguments, disagreements, fighting, or violence for that matter, we actually sit down and talk and discuss, and thrash out issues that are causing concern to various parties for that matter. So I think, because we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left before the end of this transmission, or before the end of our program, Real Talk, which actually in which we actually discuss real issues affecting real people in the wider community. Ultimately, it's very, very important that we basically look at these issues. We don't just see as another event or another act of violence being perpetrated in the name of Allah, or in the name of Islam, or in the name of God. Ultimately, we have to basically look at the issue, that what possesses certain people to act in this particular way, and what possesses people to basically kill children. Because I mean, this week's, when I saw the pictures on the news of shoes being left in the classroom, where the classroom's been completely destroyed, I even heard of stories where the attackers actually went under the tables and actually shot children that were actually were fearing for their lives, who were actually crouched under the tables. Ultimately, they met their deaths in tragic circumstances, and it's completely horrifying to hear some of the tales that I've heard this week in terms of the events this week in Peshawar. And we pray to God that this situation never happens again, and we never hear of these attacks ever again. And I think this is an opportunity for the Pakistani nation to basically search its soul, to engage in soul searching, and it's a brilliant opportunity for all parties concerned to come together to end the bloodshed. And we pray for the people of Pakistan. We pray for people, all over the world who are basically, who have been caught up in conflicts, that God actually brings peace and stability to these particular countries, and the fact that hopefully that people actually see sense, especially in Pakistan, come together and basically discuss these issues without resorting to violence. Because trust me, even I may be saying this 30 years down the line again, if I'm still on Al Mubarak radio, that I don't want to basically, talking about such tragic events like what we've witnessed this week, because it's completely saddening, demoralizing that people can actually act in this manner. That ultimately Muslims have a responsibility, especially in conflict, that they spare children, they spare innocent people, they spare women, they spare religious places, they don't desecrate the lands. These are the actual these are the ahkam of the Sharia or Islamic law, that Muslims must protect the sanctity of life, and must not engage in the killing and in the destruction of land and the killing of innocent people. Innocent people have to be said, and there's a particular Quranic verse that where you kill one person, you've killed the rest of humanity, and ultimately where you save a life, you have basically saved the whole of humanity. So there you go. The Quran basically talks about the fact that if you save one life, you've actually saved the rest of humanity. Where you've actually, where you actually kill one person, it's like as if you have killed the whole of humanity. So ultimately we have a choice as Muslims, that whether we engage, if we engage in violence, ultimately violence is not going to basically resolve any issue. And I would challenge anyone to basically go against that particular assertion, that it's only through dialogue, it's only through conversation, it's only through coming together and putting the ballot box or putting the discussion table in front of the bullets and the bomb and the gun, for that matter, that ultimately peace and stability can actually be can only be a reality once people actually come round the table and actually discuss things for the betterment of the people in any particular society, and especially for people in Pakistan. And I would actually end on this note by that we actually pray that God basically actually preserves the Pakistani nation, actually protects the Pakistani people, and we pray for the children of Pakistan, that no other child in Pakistan has to actually go through what these innocent children, they actually met their deaths in tragic circumstances. And we pray for the peace and stability for the Pakistani nation and all countries around the world. And on that note, I will actually end. I hope to see our I hope you can actually tune in to next week's Real Talk program on Friday. So without further ado, I would like to say farewell and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all our listeners and viewers, and thanks for tuning in once again to Real Talk on Al Mubarak radio and TV, and hope to see you next Friday. Fi amanillah. Just flick it over. Or you turn it off. It's called Winamp. I think so. I just flick it over. I'll show you.
Just sit here.
My eyes, I think.
Just light on it. Light too.
Yeah, done it.